Thank you so much, ladies. I want to show you some pictures from February the 9th of 2008, and Frank's going to help me with that. This is Nathan on February the 9th of '08. I think the awls are from Nathan. Anyway, he had just turned 3 years old at the end of December, so he's just barely 3 at this point. This was back when we were living in Charlotte, and what you see him playing with is actually over at our neighbor's house across the street. We had a neighbor whose name was George, and George spent a lot of time in his yard, spent a lot of money in his yard as well, trying to make sure everything was just right. But instead of putting things like pine bark or mulch or pine needles out around shrub beds, what George would put out is this white rock. And that's expensive and it's labor intensive, but he had this white rock everywhere. And Nathan at this point loved to go across the street to George's house. You see him there playing with that white rock. I had just gotten a new camera not long before then, and I was trying some stuff out, and so I just had it out on that particular day taking pictures of Nathan as he was doing something that he had done repeatedly before, which is to play with these rocks. As I'm out there doing this, Caroline comes outside to see what's going on, and she walks over there where I am with Nathan and him with these rocks. And as we're standing there, Nathan gets ready to take some of those white rocks and put them in his mouth. And Caroline says, "Are you going to tell him to not do that?" I said, "No," as every good father should. I said, "He's going to figure out pretty quickly he doesn't like it." And sure enough, Nathan starts putting these rocks in his mouth and fairly quickly decides, don't really like having rocks in my mouth. I'm very happy to announce today that we have a 17-year-old who no longer puts rocks in his mouth. And that is because I knew he's not going to like this, and I did not intervene. I did not stop it. There are instances in life and stages of life that you go through, especially in parenting, where you have children or you have grandchildren, or maybe it's even the workplace environment. There are stacks of circumstances where you are in a position where somebody may be getting ready to do something that is out of bounds, and you know that doing that is going to result in some negative consequences, and yet you decide, I'm not going to mitigate that. I'm not going to stop them from experiencing those adverse consequences. We're thinking about this as part of an ongoing series where we're looking at the life of Moses, a series that we're calling In Transit, and we're thinking about going and growing through the various seasons of life. And in truth, as a follower of Christ, whether it's those that you are and that God is using you to invest in, or maybe it is as a parent, maybe it is as a supervisor, there are going to be those people that God brings you to cross paths with that are part of your life, where you've got the opportunity to influence and to have an impact on them. And sometimes one of the influences or impacts that you can have is either to stop adverse consequences or to mitigate them. And sometimes it is the case that you'll decide not to do that. Just as I did with Nathan, I decide I'm not going to intervene in this. I'm going to let him experience the consequences of these decisions. And so the question with respect to that we want to think about is this: why would you ever do that? Why would you free people to experience negative consequences? We see the answer to that question today in Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14, if you would look with me starting in verse 39. We'll get the context here in just a moment, but we're told that Moses reported these words to all the Israelites, and the people were overcome with grief. They got up early the next morning and went up to the ridge of the hill country, saying, "Let's go to the place the Lord promised, for we were wrong." But Moses responded, "Why are you going to go against the Lord's command? It won't succeed. Don't go, because the Lord is not among you, and you will be defeated by your enemies. The Amalekites and the Canaanites are right in front of you, and you will fall by the sword. The Lord won't be with you, since you have turned from following him." But they dared to go up to the ridge of the hill country, even though the ark of the Lord's covenant and Moses did not leave the camp. And the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that part of the hill country came down, attacked them, and routed them as far as Hormah. What we see in this passage is that Moses, in this season of life, is dealing with those that God has called him to invest in, and they are making some choices that are bringing negative consequences to bear that he doesn't stop, that he doesn't seek to mitigate, that he doesn't seek to try to somehow minimize. He just lets them go ahead and experience them. Why would you ever do that? Why would Moses do this? As you are going through these various seasons of life and you're wrestling with this decision as a parent, as a follower of Christ, as a grandparent, why would you ever free people to experience negative consequences? Let me just answer that with one statement, and that's this. The target of consequence is choice, not feeling. The target of consequence, at least should be and must be, consequence, not feeling. For this passage to make some sense, you need to think about what's going on more broadly in terms of context. Moses is 80 years old. You know the story at this point. God has raised him up to be the leader of his people who have been slaves in Egypt. He works through the plagues and leads Moses to go toe-to-toe with the Pharaoh, and so they are heading out of Egypt free, finally. And so their 400 years of slavery are over, and they're finally going to be their own people in their own land that God is going to give them. They don't know where it's at. And so God is guiding them to this land that he's going to give to them. And he's providing every need that they have. With respect to direction and guidance as to where to go, he's giving them a cloud by day and some sort of pillar of fire by night, some light in the night sky that they could, whether morning, noon, or night that they were traveling, they would know the direction to go. Not only was he providing them guidance in terms of direction, but he was also giving them guidance in life. And so he was providing, and he was using Moses to be the lawgiver that he was, and we saw that just last week when he was giving the commandments, so that they would know the ways that they should go in life as they are supposed to live out standards and boundaries that God wants them to operate under. Beyond that, he was meeting their physical needs. And we saw last week how God had even caused water to come from a rock. But every single day, what they were able to experience is that as the dew fell, there was manna, this bread-like, pastry-like substance that was on the ground every single day. God has been good and is good to them and is proving to them day in and day out that following him and doing what he says is absolutely worthwhile. So finally, after all of this traveling, they are on the outskirts of the Promised Land. And Moses does what God tells him to, and that is to send spies into the land. Scout this out. I want you to know before you begin to take possession of this what you're going to experience. And so Moses sends 12 spies into the land. Likely you're familiar with this story. They come back and they say, and they're unanimous in some of their descriptions. They say, boy, this place is really amazing. These are wonderfully fertile lands and amazing opportunities for us. This is a great place to live. In fact, this is like a dream come true for us to be able to experience living in this type of territory. But it's not empty. There are people that are living in these lands, and they have cities, really nice cities that are already built, but they are big, and they are fortified. They are well equipped. Compared to them, we're like grasshoppers. And what do we do with grasshoppers? We step on them. And if we go into this, 10 of them said they're going to squash us like a bug. So 10 say, well, we just can't do this. But there were 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, who said, well, you know, they are right. These are big people, and there's a stack of them. And they are, compared to us, they're looks like a superior fighting force, but the difference is we have God on our side. God has led us to this, and if we lean on and lean into him, he's going to fulfill his promise just as he's done this entire journey. And so what we read as you get to chapter 14, after hearing 10 say we can't do this, and only 2 saying we can, verse 1 of chapter 14 says that the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. Oh. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. They were saying things like this: if only we had died in the land of Egypt or had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us out in this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it even be better to go back to Egypt? Maybe what we should do is turn around and go back and say, we changed our mind, we want to be slaves again. They've decided as a people what God has told us to do, we're not going to do. As chapter 14 unfolds, what you see is that God announces that there is going to be a consequence to that choice. And the consequence is this: no one age 20 and above is ever going to go into this land of promise. They're not going to see it. And over the next 40 years, everyone 20 and above is going to die. none of you, except for Joshua, Caleb, and their families, is ever going to step foot in this land that you convinced yourself that you couldn't take, even though I said I'm giving it to you. So that leads us to verse 39 of chapter 14. That's what's going on when we're told that Moses reported these words to all the Israelites. And the people were overcome with grief. So sad. So initially they're so sad that they can't take this land. They don't think, even with God's help, they can't do this. Then God says, you know what, because you've done this, these are going to be the negative consequences because of that. Then they well up with tears again. And they're so sad. They are so vexed. They are so overwhelmed by grief. And they get up. Verse 40, they get up the next morning, they go to the ridge of the hill country and say, let's go to this place the Lord has promised. We were wrong. We really screwed up. We messed this up. So we need to fix this. We can make this happen now. And there's a whole stack of principles at work here. And one of them is this, that delayed obedience is still disobedience. And when God tells me, when God tells you to do something, he expects it to be done when he says it to be done. You don't get just decide, maybe when I get around to it. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. They've decided, we can do this after the fact. We'll make this all better. We'll do this now. It was too late. They'd already cast their lot. They'd already made that decision. And so Moses tells them, listen, do not advance with this plan. Do not proceed. Do not go a step further with this, because he says in verse 43, the Lord will not be with you since you have turned from following him. You've decided, you've already cast your lot. We're not going to do what God says. We're not going to follow him. And so if you do this now, you're going to do it without him, and it's not going to go well. These Canaanites, these Amalekites, they're right in front of you, and I'm telling you, they are going to squash you because God is not with you. Why? Because you decided, we're not going to do this. So what happens? Verse 44 says, they dared to go up to the ridge of the hill country. No, we'll go ahead and do it. We're just going to go ahead and do it. But what does Moses do? Moses knows what they're getting ready to do is wrong. He knows that God is not going to bless this. In fact, he knows that there are going to be terrible consequences for this. People, and stacks of them, are going to die. And so what does Moses do? Does he get in front of them and say, over my dead body? Does he try to go with them and say, well, hey, guys, please reconsider, don't do that? Moses does nothing. In fact, we're told that the Ark of the Covenant and Moses, they don't even leave the camp. Moses is still cooking a hot dog over the fire. He doesn't go with them whatsoever, and what happens? They are not just defeated, we're told that they are routed. We don't know the exact number that die this day, but it's a stack of them. And they experience these consequences even though the one that is their mentor, they're like a spiritual parent to them. He knows that these costs of these decisions are real and great, but he doesn't stop them. Why in the world would he allow those negative consequences to unfold? Why wouldn't he stop it? Why wouldn't he mitigate it? Why wouldn't he diminish it? Why would he let them experience the full weight of God's consequence? Because when we decide that we're going to allow negative consequences to be brought to bear, it should be because we understand, and the target of those consequences is not their feelings, it's their choices. The target is their feeling and not their choices. What do I mean by that? The goal is to affect the decisions that they make going forward, not simply to make them feel bad. The goal is to make them more than feel bad. In fact, not even their feelings are irrelevant. Ultimately, what we want to see experienced is an effect in their choices. And that leads us to another question this text helps us to answer, and that's this. Why isn't it enough, or why is it insufficient for someone to simply feel bad? Why don't we just let some bad stuff happen, and people, like, they feel the squeeze, they feel the pain, and then start welling up with tears. Then we say, okay, now we're going to stop that. So you feel bad, you feel grief, you feel remorse, and so because of that, we'll go ahead and stop that. Why isn't it enough? Why is it insufficient simply for people to feel bad? Well, there's a few reasons, and the one is this. Feelings are short-lived. Feelings are short-lived. I don't know the extent to which you've considered this, but you me, all of us, we can be mad, we can be happy, and we can be sad in very short order, can't we? In fact, think about this week. It is likely that those polar emotions, those feelings on opposite ends of the spectrum, you have felt all of those this week. You've been happy. On the other side, there's probably been some instances where you've been sad. Likely, those of you who are married or parents, you've been mad this week. You work for anybody, you have been mad. You have experienced these emotions, all of them, polar opposite emotions, these feelings, in just the span of a week. Why? Because feelings are short-lived. Yet you're still here today. You're still functioning. You're still probably saying, I'm okay. I'm okay. Why is that? It's because adverse feelings, while they may make us feel really bad in the moment, those feelings tend to be very short-lived. Likely most of you, if not in fact all of you here today, have been to a funeral at some point. And among the funerals that you have gone to, it's likely that there is a funeral of someone who was particularly special to you, whose funeral you attended. Maybe it was a spouse, a child, a parent, a sibling. There was somebody that you were really close to, and it broke your heart when you heard that they had passed. And the thought of preparing and going for their funeral, that was a grievous thought. But you were there. You wanted to honor their life. You wanted to honor their memory. And so you're there for the visitation, whether that's before the service on the night before or just before the funeral service itself. And you're there with a family, and people are coming by, and you are heartbroken. Maybe you're standing just feet away from this casket that contains the remains of someone who is so wonderfully and so profoundly significant to you. And your heart is broken and you are so sad. And then somebody comes through the line and they start talking to you. And maybe it is that they share a memory that they made with you and the person who had passed. Or maybe it is that they begin to share a memory that they had with you at some point. Oh, you remember when we were kids and we used to blah, 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 blah. In one moment, you are heartbroken and sick. And then all of a sudden you're doing what? You're laughing. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say something like this over the years. Standing in a funeral procession, family gathering line, probably shouldn't be laughing, we're at a funeral. Right? Because funeral says I ought to be sad, and I am, but now I'm smiling and I'm laughing. Why is that? Because our feelings do like this. They are so short-lived. And so, as a parent, as a spiritual mentor, as a supervisor, as a teacher, as a grandparent, there are going to be instances where God gives you the opportunity to invest in the life of a person who you have been trying to shepherd their heart and their mind, and you're trying to keep them operating in bounds. And it may be that they decide, I'm still going to do this. And you have the power, maybe even to mitigate the consequences, or perhaps to ensure that they don't experience any negative consequences. And you say, no, I'm going to go ahead and let those happen. You allow those consequences to happen, and you allow them to continue to happen when and only when you understand my ultimate aim is not simply to affect their feelings. Because if the aim is to cause them to feel bad, they may feel bad for a little while. Feelings are short-lived. But there's another reason that feelings should not be our aim, and that's this, that feelings produce diminishing results. Feelings produce diminishing results. Parents, especially parents of teenagers, can identify with this. And likely in your experience of child rearing, you have experienced where you had a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, that if they acted out of bounds, you could say just a terse statement to them, or even a terse tone you could take with them. And they would just melt. Just become a slobbering mess. But then they're 16 years old, and you can get red in the face screaming at them, and they're like, so? Why is that? It's because our feelings over time, as we experience some negative consequence, as we experience some bad feelings, we get increasingly acclimated to that so that it doesn't bother us so much. Let me give you an example. When I first started playing the banjo, I was practicing a lot. And any downtime that I had, I would sit there and I would practice these rolls. And what was really starting to bother me was my left hand. That's where you're fretting. And on any stringed instrument, it's going to be the left hand. unless you're right-handed, where you are fretting. So I'm picking with this side, and I'm fretting with this side. And I'm telling you, my fingertips got to the point they hurt terribly. Just whether I was touching anything or not, they were so sore. I was having to use my right hand in my nose because my left hand everything was so painful. They were so sensitive. But I could sit down and play for an hour now, and it doesn't bother me. Why? Because my fingers have gotten used to it. Listen, your physical nerve feelings are very much like your emotional feelings as well. As you experience a feeling over and over and over again, it has a diminishing impact. And if you're just thinking, I'm just going to make them feel bad, I'll make them feel sad because they've done X, Y, or Z. If the goal is just to make them feel bad, not only will that be short-lived, but it's going to produce diminishing results over time. But there's a final reason that we shouldn't do that, and that's this. And that's because feelings can produce irrational results. Feelings can produce irrational results. Here's what I mean by that. If my aim in imposing or allowing or not mitigating negative consequences is just to make you feel negative, just to feel bad, that does not ensure that you're still going to do the right thing. All of this that I've just described, you see at work here. Think about what the people of God have been doing. God says, go and take this land, I'm giving it to you. They hear the report back from the spies and they say, no, we're not going to do that, not willing to do that. In fact, maybe we go back to be slaves in Egypt. And so God says, consequence. None of you is going to experience this land. 20 and above, all of you over the next 4 decades are going to pass. And so how do they feel? They feel bad. They feel terrible. It's weeping and wailing. But look at verse 40. They're overcome with grief at the end of verse 39. Verse 40, they get up the next morning and they say, let's go to where God told us to go. Their eyes have dried. The tears have ended. They're already feeling better, and they've resolved, well, we felt bad, and so now we're going to make this all better. We're going to make this all better. So we've seen how short-lived their feelings are, but then they decided that we're going to do what? We're going to go ahead now and take this. And Moses says, guys, don't do it. Don't do it. God's not in this. You have already cast your lot and said, God, we're not going to be doing what you said. And if you do this now, you're going to do so at your peril because God's not with you. It's going to be bad. There's going to be terrible consequences. And they decide what? We're going to do it anyway. Why? The first consequence, God saying you're not going to go in the promised land, why did they experience that? Because they decided we're not going to do what God said. God said, take the land, and they say we're not going to. Consequence. And they feel bad. And those feelings, those negative feelings, that leads them to decide to do what? You know what? We're going to do this now. And we're going to make this happen. And Moses says, don't do this. Don't disobey God. Don't do what he said not to do. And wasn't it just yesterday that God said, not doing what I said brings consequence? They felt bad, but those feelings changed. And now they decided to do what? We're going to disobey God again. And that's going to make things better. How much sense does that make? 0. Why? Because feelings, though real and sincere, can produce absolutely irrational results, lead us to do things that simply do not make any sense. They had disobeyed God and they experienced a negative consequence. They feel bad about it, and so what do they want to do? Let's disobey God again. I'm telling you, God's aim, and the reason that Moses sits back and he doesn't allow or doesn't seek to mitigate these consequences, that he doesn't stand in the way and say, over my dead body is something like this going to happen, because Moses understands what God understands, and that our feelings are a lousy target of consequence. What the ultimate goal of consequence is to affect the decisions that people make, their choices going forward. If you feel bad, well, that's not the end in itself. That's a means to getting your attention such that you decide going forward, I'm going to make different choices. Now, I hope that these lessons sound somewhat familiar because Jesus communicated these same thoughts in the New Testament in a parable that we know as the parable of the prodigal son. And you remember you had this son who goes to his father and demands his share of the inheritance even before the father has passed. And what does he intend to do? He intends to do exactly what the father knows that he's going to do. He's going to go out and squander it. He's going to make all kinds of stupid and boneheaded decisions. He's going to waste this money. And what does the son do? He gets as far away as he possibly can from his dad, and he does exactly what it was known was going to take place. Does the father go get him? Does he wire some money once the famine shows up? Does he try to mitigate the consequences? Does he try to cause the pain to be diminished? No. In fact, the son gets to the point where he is slopping hogs, the lowest of jobs for a Jew, and he's thinking, maybe there's some of this that I might be able to salvage for myself, that I might be able to have something to eat and not starve to death. But finally, the text says what? That when this prodigal does what? He comes to his senses. And at that point, what does he do? He decides that I want to be with the Father. Why? Because being with the Father is good. Being with the Father is right. Listen, ultimately, God wants me as His follower. He wants you as His follower. He wants us to do the right thing, not simply because that leads us to escape negative consequences, but He wants us to do the right thing because ultimately it is right and because it is good. And if we are just imposing consequences or just allowing stuff to happen with a thought, okay, well, this will make them feel bad, and that's good. Many times what we'll do is we'll put the brakes on it and we'll stop these things that God wants to allow and to cause to affect ultimately the choices of people. But we may press the brake because we're paying attention to the wrong target. If we're going to pay attention to the life of Moses and learn appropriately from him, I think what we're going to realize is that sometimes as a parent, maybe a parent of late adolescent children, grown children, grandchildren, as an employer, maybe as a mentor for someone that God has called you alongside to invest in their life and to shepherd their heart and point them to Him. And it may be that you are seeing that, man, they are going right off the rails. And I'm not suggesting that you don't say something, that you don't warn, that you don't admonish. What I am suggesting is this, that there is good reason to allow those consequences, as painful as they may be, as difficult as it may be to witness this, as grievous as it may be to watch them experience that. You allow them to experience it. Why? Because the aim is not just to make them feel bad. The aim is to lead them to decide, I want to do the right for His sake, because that is right. Listen, that's what Moses did. The question very simply is this. Is that how you're going to operate? You bow your heads with me?